So welcome back, everyone. Thank you very much for participating in our in-depth session today on rights. We've seen an extraordinary range of presentations that both link the traditional approach and challenges we've seen in copyright with new challenges in the new world. And the next session will be able to hear from three passionate and inspiring members of the Australian community who will talk to us about, again, different changes so that we're able to look at the issues of rights, of the economic, political, social and personal nature of communities engaging in this space through different lenses to be able to better inform our practice and our understanding of issues. So our three speakers today are Associate Professor Paul Harper from the University of Queensland, who is a leading international and comparative disability rights legal academic. He can't be with us today, so he has pre-recorded his words that he wishes to share with us. He's on holidays and hopefully not locked down. He was going to be in a remote part of Queensland. Anything could happen. Our second speaker will be Kylie Moloney, who's at the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, who has a very diverse background in a range of different organisations, including the Pacific Manuscripts Bureau, where she's seen a whole range of different people's access and control issues around original materials, which brings completely different perspectives. And our third speaker is the wonderful and indefatigable Professor Margo Neal, who is the head of the new Centre for Indigenous Knowledges, Senior Indigenous Curator and Principal Advisor to the Director at the National Museum of Australia, and has really made an outstanding contribution and continues to provoke Australia and the world to think differently and promote Indigenous rights and Indigenous art with great success. So with that introduction, what I might do is just hand over to the pre-recorded presentation from Paul now.
Recording this and not able to attend in person. I'm on annual leave at the moment in Port Douglas, subject to COVID, and I'm not quite sure on the internet access. So, University Libraries leading disability inclusion. That's what I've titled my speech. And let me start by today saying I love libraries. Libraries are the ticket to information. My local council library as a child, my school library when I became a teenager, and throughout my university studies and now into academia, university libraries enable me to access information. But accessing information has not always been. As a kid growing up, and until the age of 14, it was relatively easy. I would walk around the library looking at books, going through the old paper catalogues, which I used to love. But then I was hit by a train when I was 14. So on the 12th of October, 1993, my access to print material stopped. When I woke up and left hospital after being hit by a train, I'd lost my eyesight. I couldn't read print. So books were closed to me. Libraries were no longer a source of information for me. I couldn't read Braille. Ebooks were a dream. I couldn't read. Wow, what an impact it had upon me. Now, I've always believed since that day, you don't need sight to have vision. So I've always had that mantra, you don't need sight to have vision. Well, fortunately now, you don't need sight to access information. Technology has enabled the print disabled to read. So databases, ebooks, scanning technologies, all has opened up materials for people who cannot read standard print. Braille did it once, now ebooks, commercially available, have opened up millions of books to people with print disabilities. Today, I want to talk to you about how libraries have a pivotal role in enabling people to have access to material. So they have that, the libraries can transform people's access. Now, a long time ago, people with disabilities were not at university. You didn't see many students, and you certainly didn't see them on the other side of the podium. Now, at the University of Queensland, we have, in semester 1, 2020, 8.4% of our student population reported having a disability. 4.8% requested assistance. We have about 2 to 3% of staff. Universities Australia estimate in Australia we have about 1.5 million students with disabilities. So say 8% of that 1.5, we are talking a couple of 100,000 students with disabilities in this. So big numbers. What can University Librarians do? First, you need to employ disability experts. If a person with a disability walks into a library and says, I'm having trouble accessing something, they're using assistive technology. And then the librarian says, how does all the assistive technology works? Now, if you spend 5 or 10 minutes trying to explain to the person, then trying to interface, right, there's 20 minutes, 30 minutes gone. Like that. Now, I put it to you, if every interaction you had during the day cost you an extra 10, 15 minutes, then let's just say you're already time poor. Say you're a single parent, to give you some idea. Say your car broke down and you have to get, you're getting a bus instead. Well, for people with disability, time is even more precious because we have barriers. I can get a PDF I have to convert, a Word file which doesn't really work with fancy tables. People in wheelchairs might have to get support before they can even leave. Universities should not be forcing people to then take longer to get access. So what you need is dedicated staff who understand digital technologies, understand libraries, the IT support systems at the university, and assistive. So we have an accessibility and learning support officer now in the library, new position where that person has that skill set. We also have people working at ensuring access at a strategic level. Now this is starting just started, it was held up this position due to COVID. So now the idea is that when a student or a staff member has a challenge, there's someone who can actually understand the technology, not just the database, not just the library websites, not just the IT systems, but also the assistive technologies, for disabilities, a holistic approach. And also, if there's a problem, they know they can handle it, they can take carriage and sort it out. And if they can't sort it out, they can go escalate it through, for example, the University Queensland Disability Group, that which is me. I chair that group, and I can then escalate it up to the Provost and VC if needs be. So we have really clear channels. So that's great, but we don't want barriers in the first place. It's like saying, there's steps. How can the person with a wheelchair get into the building? Well, wouldn't it be much better to have built a ramp in the first place or a lift? Well, let's do that with resources in the libraries. Don't create more problems. Let's adopt universal design. So when I first became blind, ebooks were a dream. I had to scan materials. And we got Google scanners, the multi-scanner ones. UQ got involved. But I really had access to a few hundred books for a long time. Now, ebook libraries means I can access hundreds of thousands of books. I can't always get what I want. But it's amazing when I just think back how hard it was getting someone to look up or get a book off the shelf and scan it. The universities need to access materials that are more accessible. Now, in our university processes, there's a statement in the collection management process to affirm that we're going to prefer accessible. Nice statement. How's it implemented? Well, first, preferences is for ebook publishers that do not have digital rights management restricting access. So Spring is really good with that. You open it, you can read it. The idea is DRM is meant to stop people using materials that they don't have access to. Now, I'm not an IT person, and I won't say that you can download DRM stripping devices really cheaply, easily, free, and they work. So the point is, DRM really don't work anyway. All it does is restrict access and stops people with pre-disabilities, in particular, using or anyone with assistive technology. So we prefer DRM-free material where possible. And also, there's a document summarizing the accessibility of key platforms and databases. This is uploaded annually. It's great. great. It's time consuming to update. It strikes me here as a great potential for collaboration. If we shared our resource with, say, other universities, then they helped keep it all current. As a collective, firstly, it's cheaper for all the universities if there's 7 or 8 universities all sharing the cost of keeping that document updated. But also, if there's a problem and you go to a publisher and you say, well, you guys have ranked 8 out of 10, we're not going to buy you anymore. And there's 8 universities all doing that, say, well, matters. And even if they're the number 1, well, that's good for the salesperson will feed back to their design teams and their IT support teams that the people paying money, the people with the cash care. So keep it up. The people that are paying us lots of money, keeping us afloat, keeping us solvent, care. So if you do nothing more than just ask the question and get your contact to check with their digital rights, the people behind the scenes, that at least creates internal conversations that the people who are paying us money. So this is really good, but there's also excessive new emerging spaces where technology can be used to increase access. A good one, oh, by the way, just on that, it's really hard to ensure access all the time. I'm using Word and Office and Windows. We had a forced upgrade. Now I can't use it very well. Some of the things are just not working. I can't turn track changes off. I can't read comment boxes. Excel's a nightmare. It's just, I don't know why. Probably need an upgrade on my screen reader technology, but it's basically, within overnight, sort of a couple of days ago, my accessibility and usability on my laptop went down. Pain in the backside, but these things. Okay, anyway, so what can we do as libraries? Well, I'm not a librarian, but I'm a big fan of them. Well, join places that enable that free access and increase access. The Hathi Trust. University of Queensland was the founding member from Australia. Now we've got other great universities in this country joined. ANU, Monash, and University of Sydney, INUNSW have joined. Now, this digitization process started with Google Books, so millions of books, 17 million, I think, books were scanned, all accessible. Then Google Books got in trouble, but the upshot of all that litigation was people with print disabilities are able to access the full catalogue globally. So catalog, it's the masters at digitization. Last time I checked, it wasn't cataloged very well, and I haven't looked at it since. It's just, honestly, it was a pain to use, but hopefully they'll catalog it one day, and all those books will then be able to be dropped hopefully in one place, because this is what I really like is there's other sources where books are available to people with print disabilities, like Bookshare. There's ones that are available to everyone, like Project Gutenberg. So all these other resources are out there, and sometimes they don't make catalogs. I'd like to see a catalog that for all accessible material for people with print disabilities. So another really big initiative is through the Marrakesh. You would have heard about that, I'm pretty sure. Now, Marrakesh Treaty in Australia and New Zealand doesn't do a huge amount for us internally, in the sense that we all enshrine the 3-step test from the Berne Convention. People with print disabilities get access. What it does do, though, it enables us to share material easier internally and profoundly externally outside our country. Share between Australia and New Zealand, also Fiji, Vanuatu, Japan, China, America, Canada, across Europe. And that's big. I mean, you think about it. Let's say I was trying to learn Italian. Not a lot of Italian people in Australia books in print disability formats that I could use in Italian. In Italy, suspect there's a few. Spain, with their blind community, huge numbers. So there's opportunities there. So through the Marrakesh Treaty and WIPO, all those books. So what would be really good if libraries could somehow get those into catalogs to make it easy to find. Because that's a real big problem I find is you want to easily find the material. So this, I don't know how the cataloging would work, but I have a dream A dream of mine has become more of a reality. Technology has enabled millions of pages of material which hitherto were unavailable to me. I dream big. I dream of a library, a university library where so there's a group of students entering. Say, one is neurodiverse, another one's in a wheelchair, one is totally blind, another has no disabilities. All of those students can access information at the same time, without any extra change, fitting, with no time delays, can simply go in and access. We won't have students asking for help because they won't need it. It's right there. Can it be done? Well, you go and think, well, for Communist Manifesto or a law book, yeah, sure. How about something on Picasso painting? Now, how do you describe that? I don't know. How about a scalpel cutting open a heart for a video? Well, artificial intelligence is starting to make an effort at describing it. Your iPhone that will describe where you are, two face, one face. If you put on voiceover and just try and take a photo. So we're getting there. We're getting much better at these technologies. Now, what we need is to take what steps we can, because information is the key to cultural pursuit. Information is the key to political engagement. Information is the key to education, and information is the key to economic engagement, work, and libraries are often the key to information. Libraries should and can become disability champions of change. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy your conference.
So I'm very grateful to Professor Harper for giving us inspiration about the importance of the steps that we take to unlock the power of knowledge, improve human rights, and really improve discovery and the nature of citizenship and education in Australia. They were quite inspiring words. Our second speaker is Kylie, and I will pass on to her now because she's sitting right next to me. You will see me disappear and she will come into focus. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners, the Ngunnawal people, on whose land I'm presenting today, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, for they hold the memories, the traditions and the cultures and hopes of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I extend this respect to all First Nations people in attendance today. So my name's Kylie and I am the Assistant Director of the Manuscripts Unit at the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, which I will call IATSIS from now on. This afternoon, I'd like to share some of the realities and complexities that IATSIS staff experience when administering Indigenous collections whilst navigating Indigenous cultural intellectual property rights and Western intellectual property frameworks. IATSIS is Australia's only national institution focused exclusively on the diverse histories and cultures of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders Australia. We help to tell the story of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders and create opportunities for people to encounter, engage and be transformed by that story. We support and facilitate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural resurgence and contribute to shaping a national narrative. For over 50 years, IATSIS has been the custodian of a unique collection that has contributed to an understanding and appreciation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people's culture and heritage. The collection includes works by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledge keepers, artists, filmmakers, storytellers and writers. It also includes research materials documenting the cultures, lives and experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the forms of manuscripts, audio recordings, moving images, photographs, publications, rare book and serials, ephemera, art and object. So within this large mixed format collection are numerous layers of rights, including Indigenous cultural intellectual property rights and copyright. I'll now describe a typical collection at IATSIS that demonstrates the nuances of administering the collection. Gavin Breen is a linguist and he worked with the Aranda people in Central Australia in the 1960s. He has since deposited numerous audio recordings and transcriptions of his work with IATSIS. So what rights are present in this collection? The deposit form that the linguist signed when transferring the material to IATSIS indicates that IATSIS is the custodian of the material, but not the owner. The linguist and the contributors have copyright of the content of the material, and the communities whose Indigenous cultural knowledge is held within the audio recordings and the transcripts have Indigenous cultural and intellectual property rights to this material. Legislated intellectual property frameworks are designed to protect an individual's creative endeavours. However, as you can see from the Gavin Breen example, many people have an interest in the physical and the intellectual rights attached to this material. Copyright alone is not sufficient to appropriately recognise Indigenous collective rights to traditional expression and Indigenous knowledge. We must look further to acknowledge and respect the ownership and cultural and intellectual property rights Indigenous people have to this material. The work of administering these collections with complex rights is never straightforward. Early IATSIS collections sometimes have scant documentation that has often been disassociated from the collections, and the rights held within the collections are challenging to interpret. Indeed, the Indigenous cultural and intellectual property rights held by a community can be dynamic and ever-changing. If in doubt, a helpful reminder is to ask first and consult relevant stakeholders before using Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander collection material. IATSIS staff work hard to manage client expectations regarding the access and use of collection material that often contains information that is culturally sensitive. Examples include collections that refer to sacred cultural practices, landmarks, or mission records that may contain personal names and details of individuals, many of whom are from the stolen generation. The access unit within IATSIS uses a number of policies and procedures and forms to ensure that client access and use of these collections is appropriate and that they're used in transparent and are clearly documented. Some of the processes include forms that ensure appropriate clearances have been sought and approved from the creators of the material, as well as the relevant communities prior to the material being used in a publication or an exhibition, for example. These forms are also signed off for use by senior IATSIS staff. A significant part of the access unit's work is the return of material to Indigenous communities, also known as the ROMTIC program. I'd like to share an example of a recent request by a community for several hundred photographs to be copied and provided to them so they could be integrated into Ara Iricha, which is a database hosted back on country at Elcho Island and licensed by the Northern Territory Library and Archive Service. The access officer identified relevant images, sought permissions from the photographer and the community, and digitally repatriated these images back to the community. The community has since imported the images into Ara Iricha, and community members are managing access to the images, including sacred material, using various profiles and permissions. Anyone with a guest login can see the open images, and admin logins have been provided to community members who are adding descriptive data to the images, which in turn will come back to the IATSIS collections. And then there's the digital layer. The reach of digital collection material is broad. IATSIS is currently undergoing research into initiatives aimed at improving Indigenous data governance, including the use of traditional knowledge labels. In recent years at IATSIS, there's been an increase in offers of digital collection material to the IATSIS collection from donors. This includes complex and dynamic databases that may contain sensitive information and significant stories of Australia's past, such as the Return, Reconcile and Renew Repatriation Extension database. This database is largely dedicated to assisting people to locate and repatriate ancestral remains and includes information about where ancestral remains are held and details of relevant organisations, policies, collectors and repatriation events. Access is being managed by our IATSIS. The material is sensitive and access restrictions are required for appropriate use. Access is being managed by IATSIS and the RRR governance body, which is primarily made up of Indigenous people. Within the database, there are many and varied ownership, copyright and permission levels. As you can imagine, the ongoing administration, preservation and provision of access to this digital collection can and will be challenging into the future. Community consultation and engagement at every step of a collection item's journey is imperative to our collection work at IATSIS, and this takes time. IATSIS staff consult Indigenous stakeholders and document ownership and rights at all steps of the journey. This includes from the acquisition process, during accessioning and processing the collection, advice about storing the collection, and for when clients want to access the material down the track. We all have a responsibility to these collections, to the ancestors and the people that they now belong to, and to the knowledge that is held within them. We must take our time and do our very best to clarify who, in fact, has rights within these Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander collections that we manage and administer and care for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kylie. That was just terrific. Very interesting case study with many complexities. Now, I just want to remind everyone that if you have any questions that you want us to answer after we've had Margo's presentation, do put it in the Q&A area, and we'll make sure they're addressed, because I'm sure we'll have some time for Q&A. Now I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Margo Neal. Margo, over to you.
Oh, I get a second go at this. I was on mute. Sorry, gang. I'd just like to say thanks to Roxanne and to others for including me in this fabulous session of rights, and which also come as responsibilities in a whole range of ways. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on whose land we are meeting, for those who are here, and to respect their ongoing cultural rights and custodianship over this country, and extend this respect, of course, to all First Peoples. My Aboriginal name is Ngara Gurwa. I'm from the Gumbanga and Kulin nations, and my father's Irish and my mother's Aboriginal, so I'm truly a fringe dweller of the British Empire on both accounts, and thus allowed to be a bit irreverent sometimes. I'm just going to tell a couple of stories, really. I haven't really prepared a written thing. I'm just going to say how amazing the advancement there has been in the idea of Aboriginal rights and copyright and so on. Because I remember back at the Art Gallery of New South Wales a good 30 years ago, and there was no real sense of it whatsoever, and there's certainly no sense of there's the idea that if the person had passed, it was 50 years and that's it, everyone has access to all the material. But what, of course, people have learned very rapidly, 30 years is quite rapid because it's a complex area. They've learned that the maker of the material or the story holder doesn't own the story, that it isn't an individual thing at all, and that it's a collective ownership. So it's not attached to an individual. So the story lives on, is reinterpreted generation after generation. Just take the Seven Sisters songlines, which is an exhibition I've recently curated. It's kind of rapidly moving around the world at the moment. But the Seven Sisters story, of which there are many versions which are particularly related to the particular environment that the story is told, they have to negotiate themselves a lot about who has the right to speak for that story. So should somebody seek copyright over a particular painting, then you have to ask. You can't, no one, it doesn't matter how many libraries or archives you go to, you will never know what is relevant today that may not have been relevant last week. So it's an ever-changing feast. So the answer to everything is just find out and ask somebody so that anything you use is authorised from the mouths of the traditional owners, because they change too. A good example, I suppose, a variation on that theme is I did the the International Touring Retrospective of an artist you may all remember, called Emily Kamangware, who was a very a lady of advanced years who lived in the desert around Utopia, who rose to prominence in the whole 7 years, started painting in 70. So in 7 years, she, rose to such prominence. She was prolific, and obviously hardly left the place, didn't speak English or didn't go to ordinary schools. But, and was the first Australian female artist to have broke the $1 million mark with her painting, Earth's Creation, which clearly the dealer called it. So she was in the last year of her life, she was indeed the golden goose. Her contribution to the community was the money, which is not necessarily a good thing, because every male under 40 had cirrhosis of the liver. So, there's a lot of other underbelly to a lot of these success stories. But what she did is she was in hospital at some point. Relatives all came in and got her up and took her off to the dealer in Alice Springs and said, and they had lots of paintings under their arms, and they said to the fellow, we want to sell these paintings, these Emily paintings. And so he's fairly savvy, turns around to Emily, says, are these your paintings? She said, yeah, my paintings. Did you do them? No, I didn't do them, they did them. And he said, well, how come it's your painting? She said, my story, my country, my dreaming. So she'd authorised the use of the Al-Halkara story, and so one can't assume that, as in the Western world, that he or she who holds the brush may or may not hold the story, the dreaming. So there's a nice little configuration for someone. So as the art trade, blossomed and actually went quite escalated enormously over the last 20 or 30 years, as you all would know, there was, the area I was most recently working in, the central and western deserts, of which are some 50 or more art centres where all this work gets done and marketed and interfaces with the Western world. And so the art centres clearly were getting heaps too many requests to handle in relation to rights and who did what, and paying all the people who wanted to pay copyright. So they've now passed most of it on to copyright agencies. Up until, I don't know, maybe a year ago or maybe a bit longer, there were a couple of copyright agencies. There's VizCopy, and now there's just called the Copyright Agency, I think. Now there's quite a monopoly. And what's happening is that they are charging exorbitant fees for copyright, to the extent that they have charged more for the copyright of the painting than what we paid for it in the first place. So that's sort of, this is sort of overdoing the rights thing, getting money for the artists, but it becomes a huge bureaucracy and they need to take a big cut, and one wonders whether it's any more or not. But the significant point about that is that institutions like ours are now thinking we'd be better off just to buy licensing fees and not even buy the work. Now, that'd be a shame, but unless there's something happens, this is where it's heading. So that means, because it meant that we have lots of fabulous works, but we can't use them, because the minute we use them and we want to put it on our website or room brochures or any use whatsoever, we get charged like a wounded bull. Now, this is not in any way depriving the artists of their means, but this is a classic example of well-meaning, well-intentioned people going to the point that they actually kill the golden goose for everybody, and that's just a human condition. But this is what's happening now in the Aboriginal art world. at least. So, you've got to be, and I suppose the other thing in that vein is that, I'll be a bit of a devil's advocate, even in relation to protocols and things, one has to have a bit of confidence, use a bit of nous, and not what's the word, map the same protocol or the same thought. It's across every situation, every Aboriginal community, every Aboriginal issue, because that's just an inverted form of stereotyping. And so they, for example, just say the protocol of, somebody passes, is deceased. So everybody, and I've seen it so many times, they run around, they quickly take the image down off the person's image off the wall, and their name comes off the wall, and they go to publication, they Kumanjai or some other alternative name, pop it up, which is what they did with an artist very recently. And these are well-meaning, intentioned people. They haven't got like white fellas and black fellas. They are all different with different wishes and different. So in this case, the person's family heard within a day that this had happened, and they were on the phone berating the museum, ripping strips off and saying, how dare you do that? He doesn't want his reputation and his work, and he doesn't want to be lost to memory, and all of this kind of stuff. And it's the same when, I was working with, as you know, Emily Kamaiware, now it's good 20 years when I first started working with her. And the same when she passed, I discussed it with her before she passed. She was clearly going to go sometime the next couple of years. How does she want to, do we take a name off? She said, no way, you can't do that. That's my name. That's my white fella name anyway. And that's my professional name, my real name is, and she gave her real name. She said, no, that Emily and all that stuff. Ingware is a skin name. Kame is just the name of her totem. But you get the do-gooders say, no, Aboriginal name off, and they take Y off the Emily, and they take E off the Kame, and they take the N off the Ingware, and somehow they're being respectful. So no criticism of the intent, but a criticism of why don't you just find out on a one-by-one individual case in the same way as you would for, and as you would for anybody, but if you know the background to why people no longer speak. And how long have I got? Hello? One more story. When I was teaching in Arnhem Land in the 70s, as you did then, as you marked the roll and called out everybody's name. Well, I called out all the names and all Aboriginal names then, and I said, Dututnawi, and he was sitting like 4 foot in front of me and didn't answer. I said, Dututnawi, and he didn't answer. I said it a third time, and next he hid under the desk, and everybody hung their head in shame, and I was 21 at the time, and then I later found out, well, if you call the name of someone who's just passed, in this case like the night before, then you will distract the spirit from leaving the body back to where it has to go, and therefore it will remain around that community and basically cause a lot of mischief and sickness. So in the real thing is, people in the Western world, it's really only relevant to those communities. It's not really meant to be. Anyone down south in Sydney who mentions Tuta now, even if they could say it, it's not going to do that malevolent thing I just described. However, what it has done is become a protocol for demonstrating some knowledge of this protocol in the Indigenous world, and showing respect for the deceased person rather than say in memory of blah blah. So I respect the use of that protocol in that way, but I think my view is I think people need to understand what's behind the protocol, why it's done, how it's done, and don't map it across every Aboriginal person from any part or all parts of Australia. And that goes for the same with, the copyright of images or anything. You just have to ask, because I've seen people sit there for days discussing amongst each other, looking up the rules and regulations and making a decision. Well, they missed the vital element, talking to the persons. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Margo. That's been absolutely terrific and raised a lot of really, really important issues. Are there any questions in the Q&A? If anyone has, could you send me a note about them? Otherwise, I'm going to start with 2 questions. Margo, I think you and Kylie have both touched on different complexities of the theme of our overall program this year, that whole thing about access and control. And when we look at copyright and we look at rights, we're often with our Western brain set thinking about the legislation, the control. We're not really thinking about the access and use. So we create these institutions, these copyright collection societies, all of these things in the spirit of that control mindset, not thinking about, well, how can we just make it work for the things that need to be done? Margo, you've really talked about the need to, think about, well, is licensing, is that use the thing that should frame the way we look at things, because particularly the use reflects what we're going to do, which often will promote the artist, and the impact is not just the purchase and the value of that, or even in archival collections. It's not just how you acquire it and lock it down and are able to say you have it, but how you're able to demonstrate that to an audience that can either interact with those historical records or be able to commission future works or contribute in some way to the future of the artist or the community. Have you any thoughts about models you've seen that work really well, or do you want to make any more comments in relation to this? I'll start with you, Margo, and then go to Kylie.
Well, the model I would use obviously is the Songlines one that I've curated, because it's really run by the mob. Like normally when museums or galleries particularly do exhibitions, they have a good idea, they come up with a, let's call it big weather or something. They go out to some Aboriginal people and consult, and then they go and either commission some works or so on, or buy them or collect them from other institutions. Now, that model is, every model has its place. You just got to know the purpose of the model. In the case of Songlines, the idea came from the people in the desert, the Anangal mob, because they were worried about that they were the last holders of the Seven Sisters story, and when they passed, there would be no one for the younger people to ask. The younger people weren't interested in hanging around out in the desert with the oldies. They were plugged in and had screens and so on. But the elders knew that when they got married up and had kids and so on, they want to know, but they're gone. So what they did is, because they came with that idea, I then decided they owned the idea, so they owned the show to some extent, but it's a co-authored, co-designed, because they couldn't do this material, this exhibition in the museum, but I couldn't do what they know or know what they know. So I figured it's an equal set of knowledge holders. That mob had the stories and the content, and they had a real imperative, a sense of urgency with which to have it out there and put into other heritage, which was mentioned earlier. And this museum was the gallery, the exhibition was just a public face. So I set up, instead of a curator of the exhibition, we had a curatorium. So I think I coined that, as far as I know, the curatorium. So together we worked on the exhibition. They were not an advisory group, nor were they a reference group.
It's a really good example. Now I'll hand over to Kylie.
Thanks, Roxanne. I just wanted to reiterate really the collaborative nature around this sort of work, and that's the successful examples that I've seen. People who have deep relationships already help to foster these kind of work, including academics who are in the field. There are many communities who are knocking at our doors to ask for material to be digitally repatriated. And it's absolutely a journey, and it's a two-way conversation, which takes time, but is absolutely worth it in the long run, because communities get agency and ownership back and learn about their culture and so on through the collections that we have, and can also contribute descriptive data or knowledge back to the institutions. There's Canada and New Zealand are a little further ahead in this space, I would say, than Australia, but we're getting there, and we need resources to be able to do this sort of work, resources within the institutions, but it's those strong relationships with community, and often via a third party sometimes, that help this work to be successful.
Can I just say on that third party line, which is good, because I think because relationships are integral, because we're in Canberra and because a lot of the communities we may work with are up at Mardle country and near Broome or out in the desert, it is totally unrealistic to believe that a couple of visits a year over a few years is a relationship building. It isn't. So what I've done, as Kylie's just intimated, is find out people who have had 10, 20, 30, 40-year relationships with certain individuals or communities, and you work through them. Otherwise, you're just another fella from down south coming up bugging them for knowledge, and they can't necessarily trust. So the relationship may not be you and the community, but this third person that Kylie spoke of, if that's what you meant, Kylie.
Yep. So we've got probably time for one more question. We don't have any questions at the moment, other than lots of people making comments about what a valuable conversation this is. In terms of the advocacy that libraries contribute to around rights to the government, often we have previously discussed, Margo, that often it takes decades to get any good change from the government. Doesn't matter who the government is, it doesn't really seem to matter.
Yeah.
Are there any bits of advice for our advocacy program that you'd like to put on the table? I think you've talked about some really good case studies and not getting too hung up on the words and to not assume that there is one single way and one single template and one single bit of legislation that will solve everything. But are there some words you'd like us to take forward when we think about advocacy and change?
Kylie.
Okay, yep.
Well, Paul, what about Professor Harper sitting up there who hasn't had a question?
Oh, he was pre-recorded, Margo, so...
Oh, okay, all right. I don't have to worry, okay.
I suppose I think there should be absolutely an Indigenous voice in that advocacy or an Indigenous presence. So including an Indigenous expert or person or community voice when advocating for the Indigenous, rights, because they are different, as we've heard the whole day today. So, including an Indigenous voice would be my suggestion.
So that's a great suggestion, and we've got less than 30 seconds till our session ends, and we then pass over to the closing session. So what I might do is just take this time to say how fabulous it was to have Paul, even though he couldn't be here in person. He's in Port Douglas, and presumably locked down and unable to go home. But I'd rather be in Port Douglas than cold Canberra. Personal thing. But to thank you and Kylie, you, Margo and Kylie, for just exceptional thoughts this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mr. Technician Man.